everybody, I'm Dana Scheider. Welcome to A Beginner's Guide to Open Source. In this talk, I want to explain a little bit about what open source is and hopefully demystify the process of contributing, as well as figuring out some reasons why you would contribute, what you would contribute to, etc. I'm on the core team of Cucumber. If you don't know what that means, you will in a few minutes. I also work at New Relic on the Ruby agent team. As I'll explain in this talk, I work at New Relic because, like most open source maintainers, I'm not paid for the open source work that I do. This is going to be a persistent theme in this talk. So there are a number of things I want to go over here. I want to talk about, first of all, what open source software actually is, how it works, and then go into a little more detail about how you can get involved, what kinds of contributions you can make, how to get started, as well as some points on etiquette. Finally, I have a list of resources and open source projects in Ruby that you can contribute to. When I was preparing this talk, I actually tweeted at some people to find recommendations of open source projects that would be friendly for beginning contributors, as well as underrepresented contributors such as women, people of color, LGBT folks, etc. So what is open source and how does it work? According to opensource.com, which I had never heard of before I started this talk, open source software is software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. So that sounds pretty cool, but if you're anything like I was, you see that definition and it doesn't help you very much. You can see that the open source code is out there for anyone to allegedly inspect, modify, and enhance, but what exactly does that mean? Where does this code live? How come open source software gets released in regular versions? How does this not just descend into utter chaos? So, as Phil was pointing out to me yesterday, open source used to be much more complicated than it is now. Luckily for beginning contributors, contributing to open source has never been easier. Most of the code that's out there is going to be hosted on GitHub or Bitbucket or similar sites like that. There are also standard licenses that open source software is released under, such as the GNU public license, the MIT license, and the Apache license. Open source licensing is the subject of another talk, but it's worth being basically familiar with what licenses are out there. Community contributors, that means you, contribute code and documentation as well as a number of other contributions to support open source projects. Sometimes projects are sponsored by for-profit organizations. New Relic has an open source Ruby gem. Puppet has an open source Ruby project. There are a number of larger companies that sponsor open source projects, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Actually, right now, those projects often represent free tiers or free components of paid products. So for instance, the New Relic Ruby agent is free for download, but the New Relic APM site, which actually analyzes your code and returns data, is not free. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about open source maintainers. Open source maintainers are the people who keep everything running in open source projects, who make sure that versions get released regularly, who make sure that community contributions are up to the standards of the project, etc. Groups of maintainers on larger projects form the core team of the project. So earlier I said that I was on the Cucumber core team. Yesterday we saw a panel of folks from the Rails core team. That means that these are the people who are basically in charge of running these projects. Many core teams have lead maintainers. For the Cucumber Ruby team, that's Matt Wynn. It's pretty common that there's somebody who takes a sort of team lead role on core teams. Another important point that I want to make again, and I will make repeatedly during the course of this talk, is that maintainers are usually volunteers, and I would even go so far as to say almost always volunteers. That's not to say that they aren't able to make money off of the project through consulting work or through sponsorship by their employers, but in terms of the actual work on the open source project, we have paying jobs. Aaron, who we saw yesterday, is one of the preeminent open source maintainers in the Ruby community, and we heard him say he still has a job. So open source maintainers are volunteers. Some maintainers, not all, are the original authors of the software that they maintain. So let's look at some of the things that maintainers actually do. Maintainers are responsible for guiding the future direction of the project. Maintainers generally have to prioritize their paying work, although they will sometimes find clever ways to work their open source work into their paying jobs. Maintainers make the unglamorous contributions to a project. We fix bugs that are caused by the latest release of Ruby. We fix errors in documentation. We make comments on people's pull requests, things that most community contributors aren't interested in doing. We review the pull requests for the community to make sure that community contributions are merged quickly and are up to the standards of the project and do what they're supposed to do, as well as helping people put together PRs, suggesting implementation approaches, responding to questions from the community. Hopefully, maintainers are also enforcing codes of conduct that make sure that people aren't jerks to each other. And again, most maintainers do this all for free in their spare time. So how and why should you contribute to open source? There are a number of reasons why you want to contribute. Eileen went over some of them yesterday, as did the Rails core team members during the panel. There are a lot of reasons. The big one for me is that it's fun and it's a rewarding thing to do, but there are a lot of other reasons as well. I actually bootstrapped my professional career by contributing to open source. It gives you a public profile or a public portfolio of code that you can present to potential employers and say, this is something that I've written, this is something that's been vetted by a senior engineer who's often well respected in the community. This is something that can represent the kind of coder that I am. And that's really important for people who may not have extensive professional experience. Additionally, there's the benefit of improving or adding features to tools that you use. One of my first contributions to Cucumber was the fail fast switch, which is a command line switch that lets the suite exit as soon as a scenario fails. That was something that I had been wanting Cucumber to do that RSpec does, and it didn't do it yet, so I went ahead and added that. It also lets you learn new skills, familiarize yourself with a new code base, solve some different problems, so there's always an interesting challenge in open source contributions. So now that you're convinced that you should contribute to open source, what can you contribute? When a lot of us think of contributing to open source, we imagine ourselves adding a brand new feature to a project that we love. And I'm here to tell you that that's not only one of the possible contributions that you can make. I'd like to suggest that it's not the best or most valuable contribution you can make either. Other contributions that are much appreciated are bug fixes, refactors. Lots of open source projects lack test coverage. Adding test coverage is hugely appreciated. Fixing errors in documentation or adding documentation where there is none is a big one. And even fixes for typos in comments would qualify as open source contributions. Especially tests and documentation and typo fixes are things that maintainers would ordinarily take on that we don't necessarily particularly enjoy. So those kinds of contributions are very much appreciated, even if they aren't as glamorous as adding a new feature. How do you get started then? The first step is identifying some open source projects that you're interested in. I would recommend picking out several projects because you're going to find that some of the projects that you look at are not going to be a great fit for you for any number of reasons. One place to look is rubygems.org. Anything on there is open source, and some of them are larger projects like Rails, some of them are smaller projects like the Sinatra SQL extension. They run the full gamut of open source projects, and each one has needs for contributors and would be most likely happy to have your contributions. Once you've identified some projects, you want to go on GitHub or go on Bitbucket or jump on the mailing list for that project and find out what issues are being reported. Sometimes maintainers will report issues that need to be addressed. Other times, you can open an issue report yourself. Some projects even tag issues that are beginner friendly, so you'll be able to see some things that would be good for a beginner to work on. You can, like I said, also file an issue report yourself, and I often tell people that this is the first step if you want to change something about a code base or if you want to add a new feature. Make sure that you open an issue report and let the maintainers know what's on your mind. Documentation changes don't usually require an issue report. Those you can just make a straight PR. But if you have a bug fix or if you have a feature, even larger refactors, I would recommend opening an issue. And when you open the issue, be sure to mention that you're interested in actually contributing the solution. You wouldn't believe the number of times that I've gotten an issue report like, please add such and such. And it's like, I'm doing this for free, right? So if you are interested in making a PR, don't just assume that the maintainers know, let them know that you're interested. Let's see. So if the maintainers aren't friendly or helpful on the project that you initially are looking at, go ahead and find a new project. I strongly encourage you. Just like maintainers are working for free, you're working for free also. And so the maintainers on open source projects owe it to you to treat you with kindness and courtesy just like you owe it to them. So if the maintainers are not friendly to you, find a different project because life's too short. The only caveat here would be to give the maintainers adequate time to respond, keeping in mind that people have different amounts of free time to work on projects at different points, so sometimes it'll take maintainers a little while to get back to you. So once you've figured some of this stuff out, the next step is to seek input from the maintainers. One issue that I see beginning contributors make is that they think asking for help is inconveniencing us, and they'll just put together a pull request and submit it. That's a disappointment for everyone because what ends up happening is that their implementation doesn't quite work. It's not in line with what we see the future direction of the project as being, etc. And consequently, we have to reject the PR, and that leaves us unhappy because it's no fun to disappoint contributors, and it leaves you frustrated because you put in all this work and your PR wasn't accepted. So make sure to reach out to the maintainers, ask them if they're interested in what you're considering contributing, ask them if there are any pitfalls that they could see you running into, if they have any implementation suggestions. There are a couple of maintainers I know. Bundler is an awesome project for this, where the maintainers are actually willing to pair with community contributors remotely. And so they'll actually actively help you put together a PR. Finally, an important question to ask is whether there is a contributor licensing agreement, especially when you have projects that are sponsored by for-profit companies. Contributor licensing agreements govern how the company may use your code in the future. And sometimes that means, oh, by the way, we might take your code closed source in the future, use it to make a profit and not compensate you. Sucks to be you. So that's something that you want to look at carefully if you're on a project, especially one that's run by a for-profit company. So here are some do's and don'ts that I want to cover briefly. Most of them I've already mentioned. Do contact maintainers before making a PR. File an issue report, mail the mailing list, something just to let the maintainers know you're interested. I consider this an essential first step to making a pull request, and other than Cucumber, I would not dream of making a contribution to a project that I didn't reach out to the maintainers first. Do offer a PR when you're requesting a new feature or bug fix. That does not go without saying when you open an issue report. If you don't mention it, maintainers will think that you just want them to do the work. Ask the maintainers for help, pair with them if they're available. Make sure that you give them enough time and don't put too much pressure on to respond quickly. Finish the PRs you start. This is an important one, and remember that asking for help is always okay. So if you get stuck, reach out to the maintainers and say, I'm sorry, I'm stuck, I don't understand exactly how to move forward on this, can you help me? And most of the time they'll say yes. Finally, keep your pull requests focused on a single issue. So if you want to make a documentation change and add a feature, make one PR for the documentation change and one PR for the feature. That just helps maintainers stay organized and select which things they accept at what point. Here are some don'ts. Don't demand changes without offering to make a PR. That's not to say that you can't file a bug report or even request a new feature without offering a pull request, but being demanding is a big no-no. Like I said before, keep in mind that maintainers are working for free, so even if you're not able to make a pull request, be sure to be respectful of that fact when you make your issue report. Another thing that happens to a lot of beginners is that they avoid asking questions for fear of looking stupid. And in open source and in software in general, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Most of us have extremely basic questions about code bases or problem domains that we're not familiar with. So don't be afraid to ask basic questions about Ruby or basic questions about how the project works or basic questions about design. Don't be afraid to tell a maintainer that you don't understand their answer to a question when they answer it. Just be polite and friendly to people and ask whatever questions you need. Don't tolerate rude or dismissive maintainers. I've seen projects with those, and respect is a two-way street. You absolutely owe it to maintainers to be respectful of them and their time and the effort that they put into the project, and they owe the same to you. So if somebody is not friendly or respectful to you, find another project. It's not worth it. Another thing that people don't think of a lot, especially beginning maintainers, is that it's a major etiquette breach to fork a repo if your contribution isn't accepted. A forked repo, especially on a larger project, represents a schism in the community, and so it's not a casual thing to do to say, well, screw you guys, I'm going over here. So here are some final etiquette points. Like I said, assume everyone on the project is working for free. Never assume that this is somebody's job that they're obligated to do. If you want something out of a project and you're able to help with it, offer to do so. And if you're not able to help with it, acknowledge that you're asking essentially a favor of someone else. Give maintainers some time to respond to your questions and pull requests. Like I said, don't fork repos, especially, I mean, it happens, but you need to understand the implications of forking a project. Do ask nicely for help and be patient with people while they find time to respond to requests. Adhere to codes of conduct. That goes without saying. Just, it's kind of disappointing, honestly, that we have to even explain to people that you have to adhere to codes of conduct, which mainly just say don't be an asshole to other people, and if somebody tells you you're being an asshole, apologize and do better in the future. It's really not a big issue, but make sure to do that. And if there isn't a code of conduct, I recommend adhering to Ada Emke's contributor covenant. That's a general code of conduct that has been adopted by a lot of projects and is becoming a standard in the community. So if a project doesn't have a code of conduct, it provides kind of a good baseline for what kind of behavior is expected. So the last thing I want to do is provide some resources for further reading or for projects that you can start looking at if you're interested in making open source contributions. Bundler is a project that I highly recommend. Andre Arco is one of the maintainers of that and is extremely supportive of beginning maintainers. He'll pair with people, he'll provide mentorship to beginning maintainers. There are a number of other projects. Cucumber, I can speak to specifically. I chose Cucumber because the maintainers on Cucumber are extremely friendly and helpful, and that's really important to us as a project. So it's a good project for beginners as well. Any of these other projects on this list are also good choices for beginners. And I'm going to switch slides now, so if you wanted to take a picture of this one, go ahead. And then here are more open source Ruby projects that you should consider contributing to. So for further reading, there are a few options here. Your First PR is a resource for beginning open source contributors. And there's also Free Code Camp, which is JavaScript based. And finally, the Contributor Covenant, which is the basic code of conduct I recommended. So that should get you started on your first contributions to open source. Thank you.